but not explicitly. But we have to understand that if we want to understand, if we want to study biological patterns, you cannot understand them without statistics, and that the reason for that is because organisms are full of variation. So because different organisms have even within a population, organisms are variable in terms of their morphology as well as genetics. You cannot make sense of the data unless and until you look at the variation which is present. So before I start with how you test for different null hypotheses, how you set up a null hypothesis, how you test it, I like to give some idea about what is hypothesis testing. So some of you might already be aware of it, but I'll give you my version of it. So whenever we are proposing a hypothesis, when we are checking whether an organism is different from the known congeners or something like that, then so we have a hypothesis in our hand, and we want to check whether that hypothesis is true or false. But the way in which we go about it is, first we set a null hypothesis. So what is a null hypothesis? Null hypothesis is the safest bet. Many people think that null hypothesis is not present or nothing is present, and no, that is not always the case. So in the case of species description, yes, that will be the case. For example, I'll say that my species is similar to other known species and there is no difference between them, will be my null hypothesis. But in cases, there are other cases where the null hypothesis may not be exactly zero. So for example, when we look at the length weight relationships of fishes, we have a null hypothesis that the exponent b is 3. So it is not exponent is 0 is the null hypothesis, exponent is 3 is the null hypothesis. So that is the safest bet under allometric growth. And then we check the alternative hypothesis, that what if it is not true. In our case, however, in species descriptions, we'll be starting with the null hypothesis that the two organisms belong to the same species, and the alternative hypothesis obviously will be that they do not belong to the same species. Uh, it is important for us to know that whenever we do any kind of statistical analysis, we are only concerned about the null hypothesis. So all the statistics that we use in in biology or for that matter any sciences, is only to check for null hypothesis. So we never check for alternating hypothesis. We never prove or disprove alternating hypothesis. We only prove or disprove null hypothesis. So somebody might ask that, why are we concerned about null hypothesis so much? And the reason for that is hidden in the concept of types of errors. So let's take that we have a truth. So this is the truth. The truth is null hypothesis is true or null hypothesis is false. Now, truth is something that we really don't know. So this is something hidden. We don't know about it. This is the ultimate truth, and we don't know about it. But what we know is we take samples from our populations, we analyze the samples, and then we take a decision. So we have to take a decision either to reject a null hypothesis or to accept a null hypothesis, or we fail to reject a null hypothesis. So this is the decision that we can take. Now the problem is we don't know what is the real truth. So truth could be null hypothesis is true, or truth could be the null hypothesis is false. But we have to take a decision based on whatever data we have, and we take some decision. Let us suppose that the null hypothesis is true. That means whatever the hypothesis we set, in our case we set a hypothesis that two organisms belong to the same species. If that null hypothesis is true and we fail to reject null hypothesis, or we accept the null hypothesis in our decision, then we are taking a correct decision. Okay, so this is a correct decision that we have taken. If the null hypothesis is false, that means the two organisms are really different from each other, then if we reject the null hypothesis, then again we are doing a correct decision. The problem comes when the null hypothesis is true. That means two organisms, or these two taxa that we are, or the taxa that we are proposing is same as the known organism. So they are same, but we call them significantly different from each other. We call them as two different species. Then what we are doing is the type 1 error. And if the null hypothesis is false, that means two organisms are actually different, but we call them as the same species, then we are doing a type 2 error. Now, I'll tell you offhand that type 1 error is the most dangerous type of error. So we do not want to commit type 1 error. We don't care too much about type 2 error. It is important, but we don't care about it. We care more about the type 1 error. So we are always afraid of type 1 error. Now, to make you understand why type 1 errors are more dangerous than type 2 error, let's take a more a different kind of an example. Let's take a different kind of an example. So let us suppose that you are a judge into some crime, and this person, the accused person, is in front of you. Now you cannot start with a null hypothesis that the person has done the crime, because if you start that way, then there is no need for doing any judgment, because you have already dictated that he has done the crime and you hang him to death or whatever, and that is not the way to go. So always you will start with the null hypothesis that the person is not guilty. So your null hypothesis, or the safest bet that you can put, is the person is not guilty unless you can prove that he is guilty. What is the type 1 error in that? The person is not guilty, but you make a decision that he is guilty. So you reject the null hypothesis that he is not guilty, you take a decision and say that he is guilty, and you hang him to death. Or the person has actually done the crime, so he is guilty, but because you do not have enough evidence, you say that he is not guilty. In that case, you do a type 2 error. So the question is, what is more dangerous? Hanging a person who has not done the crime, which is your type 1 error, it is more dangerous, or letting go of a person even though he has done the crime, but you do not have evidence to show that he has done the crime, so you let him go. What is more dangerous? Obviously, in online talk, I don't expect that I'll get an answer for this, but it's ethically we can say that type 1 error is the most dangerous type of error. So we do not want to hang a person who has not done a crime. We don't want to call a person guilty if he has not done the crime. So we are always afraid of committing type 1 error, and I do not want to commit type 1 error. In fact, in statistics, we are so afraid of committing type 1 error that we put a very rigid condition regarding when you should accept or reject a null hypothesis. And we do that by setting the alpha. So always remember, I've seen a lot of papers where people say that we set the p-value at 0.05. That's what they write in the method section, and that is wrong. You do not set a p-value, you set an alpha, or the threshold for committing the type 1 error. So the threshold for committing type 1 error, in most cases, we set it as 5% or 0.05. And then we say that, okay, we will find the probability that we are doing a type 1 error, which is same as finding the probability that the null hypothesis is true. If the probability that the null hypothesis is true is less than 0.05, your p-value is less than 0.05, what does that mean? That means that the probability that the null hypothesis is true is less than 5%. And because the probability that the null hypothesis is true is less than 5%, I can take a risk of rejecting the null hypothesis because the probability that it is correct is very, very small. So I'll take a risk of rejecting null hypothesis, and I call it a risk because when you reject the null hypothesis, you can do a type 1 error, but the probability that such type 1 error will occur is very, very small. So I'm ready to take that risk. So I'll say that, okay, if the probability is less than my alpha 0.05, so if p-value is less than 0.05, I'll take a risk of committing type 1 error, or I'll say the null hypothesis is false, in which case two organisms, in our case, are significantly different from each other. Now, I don't know how many of you actually realize this, but this is a very, very stringent condition. So 0.5s, what does it mean? It means that if my probability p-value comes to 0.06, then I still accept my null hypothesis. Why? Because I said that, oh, p is not less than 0.05. So I do not want to take a risk of rejecting null hypothesis. So I'll accept the null hypothesis. So even though the probability that you will accept a null hypothesis, that the null hypothesis is true is just 6%, you do not take a risk of rejecting a null hypothesis. So you are so afraid of committing the type 1 error. Now, obviously, this can lead to the type 2 error, But as I said, type 1 error is something that they are more worried about. And so we always try to protect the null hypothesis. We always try to make sure that we do not commit type 1 error. Okay, so this was just a small introduction to hypothesis testing. Now let's see what kind of errors we can do in taxonomy. So in taxonomy, we can do two types of errors. One is we can say that, for example, in this case, species 1 and species 2, which are just two different samples from a larger population. We are taking two different subsamples. We are calling them as two different species, but in reality, they are actually only one species, species A, and whatever variation we see is just because of the sampling efforts that we have put in. In this case, we are doing a type 1 error. We are calling the same species as two different species because, and we have committed a type 1 error over there. The type 2 error in taxonomy is when the two organisms are actually different from each other, but we think that or we do not have evidence to show that they are different, so we call them as the same species. So you commit a type 2 error. Now in taxonomy, both type 1 and type 2 errors are problematic for us. Now obviously type 1 error is problematic. I have already explained why, but type 2 error are also problematic because in conservation efforts we need to understand the species and its ranges. So calling everything as the same species can have a problem with our conservation efforts, and so on and so forth. So we have to take care of both type 1 and type 2 errors in taxonomic descriptions. Now, as I said earlier, that a species is known by the variation. So we have to study variation in populations with respect to their morphological or genetic data, and understanding or separating the individual level variation from the group level variation are essential for delineating groups into taxa. So if you want to find out whether these different groups belong to different taxa or not, then the first step that you have to do is understand the variation, study the variation, and use some statistical some statistical framework, and try to understand whether these two groups are significantly different from each other or not. So let's see what kind of hypothesis we can put forth, and how do we test it in analyzing a morphometric data. So I'll take an example of, obviously I'll just mainly talk about fish. So let us suppose we have some fish over here, and we are trying to understand whether morphologically two different organisms, or the different organisms are significantly different from each other or not. So there are many ways in which you can find out, get the morphometric data. One way is you actually take a specimen and you do point-to-point counts using a vernier caliper, and use those counts, use those measurements for analysis. You can also do geometric analysis. So take a photograph, put landmark based analysis. That doesn't matter. So irrespective of how you collect the data, the processing of the data is more important. We'll talk mainly about that. Now, first thing you have to understand is the body proportions are allometric. Okay, and the reason why they are allometric is when an organism grows from a smaller size to a larger size, different body parts grow in proportion. So it doesn't happen that when an organism is becoming larger, the head of an organism will become unnecessarily much larger than the rest of the body. No, it will not happen. So the way in which the head will grow will be in proportion to the rest of the body. And these relationships are typically given as an equation, a power law, which is given as y is equal to y is equal to a x raised to b, where y is one character, x is another character, b is the exponent, and a is a constant. So the exponent b for two different lengths will typically will be 1. Okay, so typically if you draw for example head length versus standard length, you'll see that there will be a linear kind of relationship, because both are lengths. So if you are living in a Euclidean geometry, the world following Euclidean geometry, we expect that when one length increases, the other length will increase in same proportions. So the expected value of b, or the allometric exponent, will be more or less 1. This does not always apply. So for example, if you are looking at the weight of an organism and not its length, then weight will not scale as as 1, it will scale as cube. The reason for this is because weight at a constant density, so if you assume a constant density of an organism, the weight is equal to the volume of the, or is proportional to the volume of the organism, and a volume is cube of the length. So the way we calculate volumes is we take cubes of lengths. So typically a weight will grow as cube of any length, but two lengths will grow with a allometric exponent of 1. Now, because we know that these two measurements can grow as an allometric exponent of 1, the first thing we'll try to do is we'll do size correction of our data. Now, why do we need to do size correction? So once you collect your data, morphometric data, you'll realize that your data is significantly correlated to the size of an organism. So if the organism is small, the different things like head and everything else is going to be small. The organism is large, all the different values will be large. So you have to remove the size effect. Otherwise, when you are comparing the organisms, you might feel that all the larger organisms are different from all the smaller organisms, and that makes no sense. So you have to remove the size effect. Now, there are two ways in which you can do it. One way is allometric correction. Now, this is the equation for allometric correction. I'll not go into details of it, but essentially what you do is you find a standardized measure by looking at the allometric exponent of the previous equation that I gave you, and you standardize the length to the mean length of the entire population. So entire samples that you have. So whatever sample you have, you take the mean length of that and standardize measurements of all organisms in your collection to that mean length. Now, there are some good things about this particular method, and that is it removes effect of size and standardizes all individuals to the same size. So that's a very good thing, but it has a lot of problems also. So one problem is the correction is biased to the sample mean, because you are collecting a sample and standardizing based on the sample mean. The standardized values that you get are biased to the sample size that you have. If you are using actual values of exponent b in these cases, then it might also lead to something called as overfitting of a allometric model. And I don't have time right now to explain this in details, but those who are interested, I can explain that separately. So this model, if you use, then you are doing a size correction, but you are overfitting the allometric model to this size correction, and does not account for the scale differences. That is one problem. Now, there is another way in which you can do size correction, and if you look at that, actually it is same as the allometric method that I explained over here. So in this case, what you do is you don't standardize the lengths to the mean length of the mean standard length of the population or the sample that you have, but you make it out of 100. So you are looking at percentage of each variable. So it is actually, if you look at the two equations, both the equations are same. So instead of using the mean length of the sample, we are standardizing it to 100. So we are converting all the measurements as a percentage of the standard length of the organism. So we are standardizing it to 100, saying that if the standard length is 100, what is the length of a given measurement? The good thing about this particular model is you are not actually using the exponent b from the allometric law. So you are assuming isometry. You are assuming that the two lengths are growing with each other in a linear fashion. So the exponent is assumed to be 1, and then you calculate this value. So it is still allometric in nature, but you are assuming isometry, where you are suggesting that the allometric exponent b is just 1. Now, this actually is a better method of size correction, because it does not overfit the allometric model, and it assumes the isometry. Resulting value is independent of sample mean or of standard sample mean of standard length. So it is not dependent upon the sample size that you have, and it is easy to interpret. So when you have this kind of a standardized measure, it is much easier to interpret. but it has some problems, like it does not account for allometric variance and does not account for scale differences. Okay, so let us suppose that you have collected some data and you have done the standardization of the data. So you have collected morphological data, you have standardized the measurements. So now you can start comparing your groups of organisms. So let's start with visualizing the morphometric data. So how are you going to visualize it? Now, this is somewhere that I'm going to very specifically stress that when you have a data which is multivariate in nature, so here you have so many multiple characters that you have looked at. When you have a multivariate data, try and avoid using univariate methods. So do not use simple t-test or even ANOVA for analyzing your data, because if you are looking at one character at a time, you might that one character might depend upon other characters of an organism, but you are neglecting all those variations. So it is always better that when you have a multivariate data, you should use multivariate methods to analyze the data. Now, another problem of using univariate methods for analyzing multivariate data is you can commit something called as a family-wise errors. And family-wise errors means that family-wise errors are errors which are committed because you do many tests on the data, and when you do many statistical tests on the same data, some tests will come significant just by chance alone. So they are not really significantly different, but you might say that they are significant just by chance alone. And such family-wise error rate can increase tremendously if you have too many variables and you are doing univariate analysis for all variables separately. Then you are going to go into family wise errors and your interpretations will be wrong. So the best way of looking at and analyzing multivariate data is you use multivariate methods. Now there are many multivariate methods. I will not be able to go through all of them, but I'll make a concept of PCA clear, and then I'll just passing go through other methods as well. Now I'll also suggest one more thing, that avoid hierarchical clustering. So many people have this idea that okay, you have a multivariate data, you just find out some distance matrix and do a hierarchical clustering. Hierarchical clustering itself has a lot of issues, especially when you have such morphometric data in your hand. And I'll not go into details of it, but it has a topological problem. So we'll try to avoid those methods. The best methods that you can use to look at your multivariate data is use methods like PCA or between group PCA, discriminant analysis, and non-metric multidimensional scaling. Okay, so what is PCA? Now, the only reason I'm going into details of PCA is because if you understand the logic of PCA, you'll be able to understand logic of most multivariate techniques. So most of the multivariate techniques works in the same way. Okay, so what is principal component analysis? What I'll try to do is I'll try to explain the concept of PCA using this particular data, where I have head length on one side and head width on the other. See, when you have a data like this, so you have head length on one side, head width on the other, well, actually you don't need a PCA because there are only two variables and you can easily understand how the head length and head width are changing, right? I mean, you can see that as the head length is increasing, the head width is also increasing, and you have some kind of a linear relationship between them. So you actually don't need a multivariate technique. This data, you can just put it into a nice scatter plot like this, and that is enough for you. But when you have, say, 20 different characters, then you'll have to visualize your data into a 20-dimensional space. So your data will not be in just 2 dimensions the way it is shown over here, but you will have a 20-dimensional space and your data will be scattered in a 20-dimensional space. Okay. Now, when you have a data which is scattered in a 20-dimensional space, you cannot see that because even looking at a data which is 3-dimensional becomes difficult for most scientists. So how do you look at a data which is 20-dimensional? So PCA will help you to visualize that data in 20 dimensions or in multiple dimensions. But just to make you understand how PCA works, I'll take an example where I'll only have 2 dimensions to show. So let us suppose that I still want to do a PCA of just 2 dimensions. So what does PCA do? So the first thing PCA will do is it will look at the data and try to find out in which direction this data is spread. So if you look at this particular direction, the most of the data is spread in this direction. So, or the most of the variation is in this particular direction. So what PCA will do is it will construct a new axis or a new principal component, which instead of having a head length axis like this and head width axis like this, you will have a new axis which is shown over here as red, and we'll call that as PC1 or first principal component. So I have, so instead of using the original axis, I have now defined a new axis, which is a principal component. Now, if somebody asks you, what is this new axis? Is it head length or is it head width? Well, it is not just head length or not just head width. It is a linear combination of both. So the axis actually contains both the things. It has head length as well as head width in it. So the principal component 1, or the axis that we have newly created, has the property that it has component of, or it is a linear combination of both the head length as well as head width. So when I look at this new axis, I'm not looking at head length or head width. I'm looking at the effect of both in my data. Okay, and these values lambda 1 and lambda 2 will tell me how what is the importance of that particular value on that component. So if lambda 1 is larger than lambda 2, I'll say that head length is represented more, or it is varying more on the first principal component. Head width is represented less on the principal component 1. Okay, so instead of looking at this and this two separate axes, a head length and head width as different axes, we have now created a new axis called principal component, which contains both head length as well as head width. Now, once you have that, PCA, next thing PCA will do is it will now find a parallel perpendicular axis to the first principal component into the direction where the next variation is available. So if you look at the first principle, most of the variation was in this direction. So I made a principal component in this direction. Now the remaining variation is in this direction. So this is my PC2. This is my second principal axis. Now again, if you ask me what is principal component 2, it is not head length, it is not head width. It is again a linear combination of head length and head width. Now again, so I'll have lambda dash 1 and lambda dash 2 as coefficients of head length and head width, and they will tell me what is the contribution of those characters, head length or head width, in that particular axis. So probably it might happen that head width is more variable in this axis, or so I'll say that head width is more important character in PC2 than head length. So when we are looking at data on PC2, head width is the more important one. Now obviously you will not realize the importance of PC1 just by looking at two-dimensional, such a simple two-dimensional data. When you have an n-dimensional data, you are trying to create principal components in such a way that you are trying to explain most of the variation in the data using that principal component. Okay, so for example, if your first principal component explains 80% of your variation, then when you look at your data from the principal 1 component point of view, then the data that you are looking at on the principal component 1 is actually the 80% variation in the entire data. So you are actually looking at 80% of the entire data on just one axis. So if you have a 20-dimensional space, well, you don't have to look at 20 dimensions. One dimension, if it is telling you 80% of the variation, by just looking at one dimensions of PC1, you can actually find out more about how the data is spread. So in that case, I look at PC1, I look at what is the lambda 1, lambda 2 or coefficients of different variables, and I can find out which variables are important ones. So if on PC1 head length is the most important variable, then I know that the most important variable which is varying in these groups is the head length, and so on and so forth. Now you have to understand one thing, and that is, if you have two variables, you will have two principal components. If you have n variables, you will have n principal components. So this is a very weird statement, okay, but that is how it works. Okay, so if you have 20 variables in your data sets, you will actually end up with 20 principal components in your analysis. Now you'll say that, oh, so what's the use if I had 20 variables and I could not look at them? And then you say that make principal components, and now you have 20 principal components. So how can I look at 20 principal components? That's where the beauty comes in. The principal component beauty comes in, and that is, if you look at, so what I have drawn over here is these blue bars are the eigenvalues. Now I'll not go into details of that. What is the red curve is the cumulative variation explained by each principal component. You'll see over here is that the first principal component is explaining almost 65% or 62% of the variation in the data. And if you look at the data on second principal component, cumulatively both of them are explaining almost 85% of the variation in the data. If you look at the remaining principal components, they are also explaining the data, but not as much. So what I can do is, once you do a principal component analysis, you don't actually have to look at all principal components. You can just look at the first two, and the first two itself explains 85% of the data. So you don't have to look at the remaining principal components. So the beauty of this method is, even though it produces a lot of principal components, because remaining principal components tell you very less amount accounts for very less amount of variation in the data, the first two or three are enough to look at most of the variation in the data. Now, again, some biologists don't understand this. So they will say that, looking at this, they will say that, oh, so the first two principal components are explaining 85% of the variation. That means the remaining components are explaining 50% of the variation. If I just plot first and second component, I'm only looking at 85% of my data. I'm not looking at 100% of my data. Yes, but when you had a multivariate data, anyway, you were not able to look at 100% of your data at all, because the data, the data was multivariate. You were not able to look at anything. By converting it into principal components, at least in the first two dimensions, you are looking at 85% of the data. So in that case, in principal component analysis, if I use principal component analysis, I can just plot one or two axes, and that is good enough for me. That is good enough to represent, get a representation of my data and start visualizing it. So I'll give you one example over here. So let us suppose that we have some groups of organisms over here, and I have plotted them on the first principal and second principal axis. You'll see that the first one is explaining 75% of the variation in the data. Second one is explaining around 16% of the variation in the data. So in total, they are explaining around 90% of the variation, which is good enough. So most of the variation in the data is explained. So the beauty of this is, perhaps I had 10-15 different characters over here. So my scatter would have been 20 dimensional or 15 dimensional scatter, but by just looking at 2 dimensions, I'm looking at most of the variation in my data. Okay, now when you plot a graph like this is called a PCA scatter or factor scores. This is not a PCA biplot. Some people mistakenly call this as PCA biplot. This is not a biplot. What you have plotted is the factor scores. So in the new axis that you have created, PC1 and PC2, you have plotted the factor scores for observations. This is called a biplot. And in a biplot, you have both the factor scores of observations, which are blue, red, and green over here, and the factor loading of the eigenvectors. Now, what does this graph tell you? Now, they will always start at the origin. So these are vectors and they are starting at the origin. Now, I'll not go into the mathematics of this, but I'll tell you what does this graph tells you. Now, this graph is telling me that head length is increasing in this direction. So can you see I have actually drawn it as an arrow because this is a vector. So it is increasing in this direction, which means that as compared to the blue and the green organisms over here, the red organisms have larger heads. And blue and green ones have smaller heads. That's why they're going on the negative side of HL, and red one is going towards the positive side of HL. TW is going in this direction. That means the green organisms, the green organisms have more character. TW character is increasing in this direction. HW character is increasing that direction. You'll see that KL is a very small vector, so this variable is not important. So we can actually remove this variable, and it is not telling you much about the data. So it is not varying to that much in these organisms. Now you can do a visualization of this, but if you ask me, does this tell me that the red, blue, and green are three different organisms? Are they significantly different from each other? Well, I'm going to talk about statistical testing a little bit later, but there is one way in which you can analyze that, and that is by plotting a 95% confidence interval. So if you plot a 95% confidence interval, what does it mean? This means that based on my data, blue points over here, I expect that most of the organisms of this blue type will be in this interval. So 95% of the population should be in this blue interval. 95% of the population of red will be in this red interval. 95% of the green will be in this green interval. Now, obviously, 5% of the population might be outside this ellipsis, but 95% of them will be in this case, in this ellipse. In which case, I can say that if two organisms do not, or if the 95% intervals of two organisms do not overlap, then the probability that they will have they will be still same groups is less than 5%, because in 95% of the cases they are not interacting with each other, or they are not overlapping with each other. So there are only 5% chances that they might overlap. So this is one way in which you can try to understand whether these groups form significantly different clusters or not. But there is a statistical way of also testing it, and I'll come to it a little bit later. Plotting a nice biplot with 95% confidence interval obviously gives you a better understanding of how your data is scattered. So whether your organisms form different clusters or not. If they do form different clusters, then what are the characters that separate the clusters, and are the clusters significantly different from not? So this particular data tells you gives you all the information. This is one example that I talked about the other day, and this is about Channa micropeltis and diplogamma. Here you can see that this is a biplot where we have shown that diplogamma is different from micropeltis, and these are the characters which separate it. You can also give a biplot along with this plot. This is called a scree plot. So I explained this plot before to you. This is called a scree plot, in which you show the contribution of different principal components, and so essentially what information you are giving is, even though we have only shown PC1 and PC2 in this diagram, the third, fourth, and remaining principal components are also explaining the remaining variation, but it is not as much. So most of the variation, so in this case you can see that 98% of the variation is explained by the first principal component itself, and the remaining 2% is explained by the remaining variables. So you don't even need to look at remaining variables. The first principal component is nicely explaining how the organisms are varying from each other. So you can make your graphs very informative by giving multiple data. So you can give factor scores, you can give factor loadings, you can give scree plots in the same plot, and explain, give all the necessary statistics to understand your data. Now there is one problem, and that problem is, I told you that principal component analysis, the way it will work is, it will first find out the maximum variation in the data, and then the second component will look at the second maximum variation in the data, the third component will look at the third maximum variation in the data, and so on and so forth. Many people think that if you do PCA, just plot first 2 dimensions and that is good enough. So don't talk much about, don't look at how much variation it is explaining. Just plot first 2 dimensions, that is good enough. And that is a wrong thing. Okay, you have to be very, very careful about looking at how much variation your data is explaining, or your principal components are explaining. So for example, if there is a case where the first and the second principal component is just explaining, say 20% and 10%, or total 30% of the variation in the data, then doing a principal component analysis is a wrong thing. You should not go for principal component analysis. Now, why will you get such kind of a thing? So can that happen? Yes, it can happen. If your organisms are very, very similar to each other, then you'll see that the principal component analysis will not be able to show too much variation in a few dimensions. It will need more dimensions to show the variations among these groups. So principal components, you have to be very careful when you are using it. Check how much variation your principal component is explaining, and then only use it. If your principal components are explaining more than 50% of variation, then there is some sense of using principal component analysis. If it is not showing much variation in your data, do not use it. So scree plot over here is very, very important. You have to look at the scree plot. So in this case, you will see again that the first two components are explaining most of the variation in the data. The remaining are explaining the variation, but they are not that much important. So I can neglect them. I can just look at the first two dimensions. That is enough. In some cases, you will see that the first three dimensions might be good, the remaining dimensions may not. In that case, you should plot your data in 3 dimensions, not 2. If you see that even the first 3 dimensions are not explaining much variation in the data, forget about PCA. Do not do principal component analysis. Okay. Why? So as I said, that the problem in PCA is, if you are trying to understand whether different groups are different from each other using principal component analysis, and if those groups are of very closely related organisms. So if you have organisms like, say, cryptic species, if you have cryptic species, morphologically, that's why they are called cryptic, because morphologically they are very similar to each other. And if they are very similar to each other, then principal component will not be able to separate them efficiently. And why is that? Because when you are doing PCA, you are giving equal weightage to all variables, and that is a problem. You are getting so you are saying that all variables are equally important. But what if some variables or some characters are more important to separate the organism? Well, there is one way in which you can account for this, and that is, instead of using PCA, you can use between group PCA. So in between group PCA, what you will do is, you will try to extract the principal components in such a way that the characters which are separating the groups will be given more weightage than characters which are not separating the groups. So here what will happen is, you will actually give more weightage to characters which are more important to separate the closely related organisms. So you will see that in between group PCA, the number of PCA axes you will extract will be actually less, because even in that case, you don't need so many axes will not be extracted by PCA. It might just extract 2 or 3, and you'll be able to see the variation in just 3 dimensions. Now, in this particular case, this was a paper that we published recently. You'll see that we have some overlapping organisms. Now we have just plotted in 2 dimensions. If you plot this in 3 dimensions, then you can actually see that even this overlaps vanishes. Okay, so this is a concept of principal component. So principal component and between group principal component. So what between group principal component will do is, it will maximize the variation between the groups, and will show you better will give you better understanding of whether the groups are different from each other or not. A similar concept to this is called discriminant analysis, and even though this one method works on slightly different mathematical manipulation, essentially what you are doing again is, if the organisms are very closely related to each other, then by using discriminant analysis, you are asking a question: can you discriminate between these different organisms, and what are the characters that you can use to discriminate between them? The logic in which you find the DA axis is similar to PCA. The only difference in DA is, again, you give importance to those variables which are important for separating the group. So you give more weightage to variables which separate the groups. So this is another very nice method by which you can find out whether organisms are different from each other or not, and which characters which separate them. For example, Hydrophilus bovis over here separates from Malvarica by one very important character, that is head length. So head length of Malvarica is much larger than bovis, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, if your data, it is possible that your data may not be, your first 2 axes may not be enough to show your data. So this is a nice example where we have shown that in this group of frogs, if you plot the data in 2 axes, you might feel that some organisms are overlapping. But if you look at the scree plot, you can see that the first, second, and third discriminant axes are better to explain the data. So 4th onwards, the variation explained is very, very small. So the first three are more important. So you can plot the data in 3 dimensions, and now you can see that they are well separated. So all different groups are very well separated. Um, the difference between principal component and DFA and the next method, which is non-metric multi-dimension scaling, is in principal component, we actually take the original data and we plot the data and try to understand how groups are related to each other. Now, in case of non-metric multi-dimension scaling, what we will do is we will try to understand the clustering of organism by finding some dissimilarity or distance matrix. So we'll take organisms, we'll first find out their dissimilarities or distances, and then we'll plot the distances and then see whether they form different group or not. So this is a very nice method, and in fact, in some cases we actually prefer non-metric multidimensional scaling over PCA, because if you are actually interested in finding the groups and looking at how the groups are spread, then this method is better, because you actually find distances among organisms and plot them. Now, these distances can be anything, like you can have Euclidean distances, chord distances, Bray-Curtis or Jacquard, or different types of distances, and you plot them. See, the problem is, again, you have a distance matrix which is dependent upon how many organisms you have. So if you have, say, 100 organisms, your distance matrix will be 100 by 100 matrix. Now, when you have so many, such a huge matrix, and you are trying to plot all the distances in 2 dimensions, then you are distorting the distances. To give you an example, let us suppose I want to plot the distance between Pune, London, and New York. See, the problem is, if I want to plot it in 2 dimensions, it is going to be weird, because we live on a 3-dimensional globe, and the distances are 3-dimensional, and you are trying to, if I try to plot these distances in 2 dimensions relative to each other in 2 dimensions, then I have to distort those data and put it. So what non-metric multi-dimensional scaling will do is, it will distort the distances and plot it, but it will give you some statistics to understand how much distortion has happened. So that is done by something called as a Shepard plot. So in Shepard plot, we have observed dissimilarity. So this is the real values of dissimilarity that we fed to the software, and this is the ordination distances, or the distances which are plotted on the first and second dimensions of NMDS. And if the two are, if there is a linear relationship between the two, then that means that there is a good correlation between the observed distances and the distances that you have plotted. So which means that your NMDS is a very good way of looking at your data. If, on the other hand, if the relationship was not linear, then you would have said that no, you cannot use NMDS to look at my data. The another way of looking at whether data NMDS plot or whatever you have plotted over here makes sense or not is look at the stress value. So stress value tells you whether you can rely on the scatter shown in the NMDS plot or not. So a zero stress means that the scatter shown is perfect and it is true to the real distances among the organisms. 0.1 to 0.5 is excellent. 0.05 to 0.1 is good fit. 0.1 to 0.15 is a fair fit, and if the values is more than 0.15, in some cases people say more than 0.2, then you should not plot your data in NMDS. Now, these are some things that you have to understand, that, and that is where many biologists fall short. And that is, when you have a data, you just do a PCA, you just do a DFA, or you will just put a NMDS and show the data. But you should also understand, you should look at what is the reliability of your analysis. So if the NMDS stress value is more than 2, then plotting that makes no sense, because your distances are completely messed up while plotting the data. So you should not even use NMDS in that case. In that case, go for other methods. Wherever possible, go for PCA or DFA, but you should not use this method. Okay, now you can still look at whether the groups are significantly different or not by plotting 95% confidence interval. That is one way, or there is another method which I'll come a little shortly. So this is one example. So here we looked at different populations of the same organism, and you can see that our stress value was pretty good enough. So we found out that these different populations, even though there is variation in the morphology, it is not significantly, the populations are not significantly different. Okay, so you plotted a PCA, you plotted an NMDS, but how do you know, how do you test the statistical hypothesis that your groups are different from each other? So you have to statistically prove that the groups are different, right? So how are you going to do that? Now there are two ways in which you can do it. First, you have to find out whether your data is multivariate normal. If your data is multivariate normal, you can go for a parametric method called MANOVA. If your data is not multivariate normal, you can go for non-parametric methods like PerManova or ANOSIM. So this is the how typically I will go. So if I have a data, I'll first plot it as PCA or NMDS or discriminant analysis, one of the methods, and then I'll do one of the methods like MANOVA, PerManova or ANOSIM to find out whether the groups that I see in my PCA or NMDS or DFA are significantly different from each other or not. Okay, so I'll plot NMDS or PCA or DFA, and I'll also do this analysis and prove that the groups that I see are significantly different. Only then I can say that since there is a significant difference, the morphologically these organisms are significantly different, so probably they are different species. Okay, so what is normality? Normality is when a character follows a bell-shaped curve like this. So this is a, if you have one character, say head length, and it follows a nice character, nice bell-shaped curve like this, most of the organisms are at the mean over here, and there is some scatter but not much, and the scatter is equal on both the sides. In that case, you say that your data is not normally distributed. The same case goes for a multivariate normality. So here I have shown two variables, but you can have n variables, and n variables will create a scatter for which you can try to understand whether that scatter belongs to multivariate normal distribution or not. The univariate normality is checked by these different methods. Shapiro-Wilk is one of my favorite methods, so you can go for that. And multivariate normality again is checked by many different methods, but Durnik and Hansen omnibus is my favorite one. So typically what the way I'll go is I'll actually first take my data and look at whether my data is multivariate normal or not. If my data is multivariate normal, so the null hypothesis is that data are multivariate normal, I'll do a Durnik and Hansen omnibus and check whether my null hypothesis is rejected or accepted. If I accept the null hypothesis, I'll say that my data are multivariate normal. And if the multivariate data is multivariate normal, then actually it saves a lot of good things for me. Okay, one is, in that case, I'll not go for PCA at all. I'll not do PCA analysis. I'll only do DA analysis. I'll do discriminant analysis because it requires multivariate normal data. And to find out whether groups are significantly different or not, I'll do a MANOVA test. Okay, so I'll go for MANOVA and DA. On the other hand, if my data are not multivariate normal, then I'll go for non-parametric methods. So the multivariate MANOVA, multivariate analysis of variance MANOVA has a null hypothesis that all groups have the same mean. And if you can do this test and find out. So if your data is multivariate normal, you do a MANOVA and find out whether the groups are significantly different from each other or not. Now there is one thing that you have to understand. The null hypothesis of MANOVA is all the groups are same, but the alternative hypothesis is at least one of the group is different. Okay, so it does not check whether all groups are different. It will only check whether one group is different or not. So even if one group is different, all other groups are same, but one group is different, then MANOVA will be significant. So if the MANOVA is not significant, you'll just say that all groups are same, and so morphologically all organisms are same, and that's the end of the story. If the null hypothesis is rejected, and if you find out that at least one of the group is different, then you have to do a post hoc analysis. So then you will run the same MANOVA but taking two groups at a time. So if you have 5 groups in your data set, first you will do a MANOVA, check whether all 5 groups are same or at least one of them is different. If one of them is, at least one of them is different, then you'll do pairwise MANOVA. So you'll do pairwise comparisons and then find out which groups are significantly different from each other or not. But I told you, if you are doing multiple tests on the data, you go fall into something called as family-wise errors. But there are ways to solve it. So one way is you can use sequential Ben-Ferroni correction. Again, I'll not go into details of this. Those who are interested, we can discuss about it later. And then you find out whether or groups are significantly different or not. So I'll give you one example. So we were looking at this 4 species over here of Sperotheca, and we wanted to know whether they are significantly different or not. Obviously, the first thing I did was I checked for the multivariate normality. It was the data was multivariate normal. Because it was multivariate normal, my life was made easy. I only went for DFA, discriminant factor analysis, or DA, and this is the DA plot. You can see that DA only extract very few variables, even though or few components, even though there are so many variables in my data, because those many are enough for explaining all variation in the data. And then I did a MANOVA over here, and I showed that each species is morphologically significantly different from each other. So one graph over here gives me all information. It tells me that all groups are significantly different from each other, and it also tells me which characters I can use to separate those species. So I can just look at the vectors. The vectors which are very long are significant, very good characters. So I can use these characters to separate the species. If your data is not multivariate normal, this will happen actually many times. And when your data is not multivariate normal, you can go for two different tests. One is PerManova, which is my favorite test, but you can also go for ANOSIM, which has certain issues, but it is also a good test. So you can use any one of them. So PerManova or permutations multivariate analysis of variance is a non-parametric test. And the null hypothesis is centroids and dispersion of the groups as defined by the measure space are equivalent for all groups, and the alternating obviously is they are not equivalent. So again, it has the same problem. So if your PerManova, so null hypothesis of PerManova is all groups have the same centroids, that means they are all same, and the alternating hypothesis is at least one of the group is different. So even if one group is different, the PerManova will be significant, in which case you will have to do a post hoc analysis and do a PerManova between two groups at a time, and then check which groups are significantly different from each other. Okay, so so here we did the same thing. So we plotted PCA first, but our data was not multivariate normal, so we used PerManova, and in PerManova we found out that each four species over here were significantly different from each other, and these are the p values for how different they are. So we did a PerManova to show that at least one of the group is different, and then we did a pairwise test to look at how each group is different from each other. ANOSIM also works on a very similar concept. So it is a non-parametric method again, and the null hypothesis is the similarity between groups is greater than or equal to the similarity within the group. So if between group similarity is same as within group similarity, then the groups are same. If the two groups within group similarity is low and between group similarity is very high, then the groups are different from each other. Okay. Now I'll quickly go through. I'm a bit sorry over here. I've taken a slightly more amount of time, but I'll rapidly go through how to analyze molecular data, where again we can use statistical methods. So we can have test of monophyly, which can be used through which we can run through bootstrapping and Bayesian posterior probabilities. We can do test of topology, genetic structure analysis, and species delimitation. So most of you those who work on molecular phylogeny might already know that when you have clades like this for between species 1, 2, 3, for example, and 4, 5 over here, how do you know what is the reliability of that clade? So there are two ways. One is non-parametric method of bootstrapping, where you do subsampling multiple times depending on how many iterations you have said, and plot the trees multiple times and then see how many times the two organisms come together. So when I say that the bootstrap over here is 100, that means species 4 and 5 under all sampling conditions always came 100% of time they came together. So I'm 100% sure that this clade is a significantly different clade. So it is a monophyletic group. The Bayesian statistics works in a slightly different manner, but it has similar properties. So here you will find out the posterior probabilities, and when the posterior probability is 1, that means 100% of the probability of these two organisms coming together is 1. When the probability decreases like 0.65, 0.83, then you say that sometimes they may go with other, they might form groups with other species, and that's why those clades may not be. For example, this clade is not much well supported. Um, you can also have test of topology. So for example, sometimes the trees can have different topologies, alternate topologies, and when you have alternate topologies and you want to compare them, you can use statistical tests to check that. Now how do you use that for your taxonomic papers? So for example, if I want to say that my organism X is actually forms a clade with this group of organisms and not the other group of organisms, then I want to significantly show that it is significantly different from other group of organisms, so it will never form a clade with the other group. So what is the way in which you can do is, so you can create a topology where you put that organism deliberately into the other group and then find out what is the log likelihood of that tree, and then you find out the log likelihood of the original tree where the organism belongs to the other group, and then you compare the log livelihoods of different trees and find out which tree actually makes more sense. So given the data, which tree makes more sense. So there are multiple such statistical tests. Again, these are very, very complex topics, so I'll not go into details of most of them, but there are tests like KH test, which will look at the topology of different tree topologies, and the null hypothesis check various null hypotheses. So this is SH test, which again is a non-parametric test and checks for topologies, alternate topologies of your trees. This is a very nice test, SOWH test, which again looks for topology, but it is based on parametric bootstrap values, which is also called as Monte Carlo simulations. And you again, this is a very nice technique where you can try to figure out whether the topology of the tree that you have got, where your species is related or is a sister taxa to another known species, whether this topology is valid or not. So is it true or not? So you set a null hypothesis that the topology is true, and then check for alternative topologies in the mix. Now such kind of analysis we have used for one of our papers. Those who are interested can go and have a look at them. So I talked about this peninsular trout dilemma. So here we showed that this organism, which we used to call as a trout in Peria River, is not trout at all. It is not related to trouts or schizophrenic fishes which are found in Himalayas. And to prove that, we use such topology tests. So we tried to check whether is it possible that this organism is related to schizophrenic fishes when our ML tree shows that it is related to barbs. So you can create alternate topologies and check their significance. You can also look at genetic structuring using a method called analysis of molecular variance. Now, this is a very similar method to analysis of variance that we use, but you look at the molecular variance, and this is another statistical test you can use to find out whether, if you have groups of organisms, whether those groups of organisms are significantly different or each other or not. So again, what you do is, for each group, you look at how much variation is there within a group and how much variation is there between the groups. If between group variation is larger and within group variation is very, very small, then obviously those groups are significantly different from each other. Let us suppose this is one group where this is your variation, so it has a large variation, and this is second group which also has a large variation. Then these two groups are overlapping, in which case you don't say that they are significantly different from each other. So this way you can again find out whether groups are different from each other or not, and use it for your taxonomic hypothesis testing. There are also concepts of genetic gaps, where you look at again the same thing. You look at how much variation is there within genetic variation is there within a particular taxon or a group, and how much variation is there between the groups. And if the within group variation is smaller than the between group variation, then you can use it for species delimitation. Now again, these concepts mathematically are slightly more rigorous. I'll not go into details unless somebody is interested. And similar methods are available for through different statistical tests. For example, Poisson tree process again looks at very similar things, but it looks at inter and intra branch substitution rates. So it does not look at molecular distances, but it looks at the branch lengths within a group and between the groups. GMYC looks at so it takes a calibrated time tree, and then again looks at the branch lengths. Okay, so it looks at inter and intra-species branching rates. So it looks at branching rates. So using that branching rates, it tries to find out whether organisms are different from each other or not. And a similar concept is used for BP and P. So you can also do species delimitation using various statistical tests. Now this is one paper that we published last year. So what we have done over here is, again, we have some genetic structuring over here, and we try to understand whether we can delimit the species using multiple statistical methods. So we use ABGD is similar to barcoding. So we looked at barcoding, we looked at poison tree process and GMYC to find out whether these groups are significantly different from each other or not. So you can use such statistical tests to check your alternate taxonomic hypothesis. So statistical methods provide robust means to test alternate taxonomic hypothesis by accounting for variations within and among populations, and we can look at both genetic as well as morphological variations. So with this, I'll stop. If